A little boy sells his winter coat to pay for his sister's funeral, shivering in the cold, when a billionaire pulls up. What the man does next makes the boy instantly burst into tears. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Max pulled the coat tighter around himself, but it did little against the wind knifing through the thin fabric. His fingers, red and stiff with cold, trembled as he gripped the bundle. It was his father's coat, the only thing left that still smelled like him. Max took a breath, trying to catch a trace of that faint scent of pine and old leather, but all he got was the biting chill of winter. He stared at the pawn shop's fogged-up window. Inside, an old man in a stained cardigan sat behind the counter, peering at a tiny television with a bored expression. Max swallowed hard, then pushed the door open. A bell chimed, sharp and loud, making him flinch. The pawnbroker looked up, eyes flicking from the coat to Max's face, then back again. "What you got there, kid?" he asked, not unkindly but not warmly either. "It's my dad's," Max said, voice small. "It's real leather. I just need." His voice wavered. "I just need a little. For my sister." The man frowned, setting his glasses higher on his nose as he took the coat and inspected it. Max shifted on his feet, socks damp from the snow seeping through the holes in his sneakers. He rubbed his fingers together, willing warmth back into them. The silence stretched, broken only by the low drone of the TV and the click of a cash register drawer somewhere in the back. "Best I can do is 20, the man said finally, setting the coat on the counter with a sigh. "It's old, kid. Zipper's busted. Got a stain on the sleeve, too." Max's heart plummeted. 20 wouldn't even cover a bouquet, let alone anything else. He clenched his hands until his knuckles ached but managed a nod. "Okay," he mumbled, voice tight. He took the crumpled bills with numb fingers, trying not to look at the coat as the man folded it up, out of sight. It was just a coat, he told himself. It wouldn't bring Lily back. It wouldn't keep Mom from crying herself to sleep every night, thinking Max couldn't hear through the paper-thin walls of their apartment. The bell chimed again as Max pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold slapped him in the face, harsher without the coat's meager protection. He pulled his sleeves down as far as they'd go, but the wind wormed in anyway, making him shiver so hard his teeth clicked. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray sky, sticking to his hair, melting on his cheeks. The air stung, dry and cruel, and each breath seemed to slice through his chest. Max started walking, boots scuffing over the icy sidewalk, but he couldn't feel his toes anymore. He wasn't sure where he was going. Home, maybe? Except home was just four walls and a mattress on the floor and a pile of bills no one dared to open. His mother's eyes, red-rimmed and dull, floated in his mind, and he squeezed his own shut, biting down on his lip until the taste of copper seeped onto his tongue. A gust of wind caught him off guard, nearly knocking him sideways. Max stumbled, catching himself against a lamppost, breath puffing out in ragged clouds. His hands were like ice. He rubbed them together, though it did little good, and kept walking, head down, shoulders hunched. The rumble of an engine cut through the silence. Max glanced up, startled, as a sleek black car rolled to a stop by the curb, the kind with tinted windows and rims that gleamed even in the dull light. The door swung open, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. The man's eyes, sharp and appraising, settled on Max, narrowing a fraction. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Then the man's gaze shifted to Max's shaking hands and a thin sweater stretched over his frame. Max flinched, instinctively backing up a step, but the man just sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose like this was all some great inconvenience. Without a word, he shrugged off his own coat, thick and dark and probably worth more than everything Max owned put together, and draped it over Max's shoulders. The warmth was instant, wrapping around Max like a blanket straight from the dryer. The lining was smooth, smelling faintly of cedar and something expensive. Max's knees buckled a little, and he gripped the front of the coat with fists that barely seemed to belong to him. He didn't mean to cry. It just happened, the tears hot and sudden and blurring everything until the streetlights bled into smears of yellow and white. His breath hitched, and he pressed a sleeve to his face, trying to stop, but that only made it worse. The man took a step back, eyes widening slightly, clearly not prepared for this reaction. "Hey," he started, voice uncertain. "Look, it's just a coat, kid. Don't, are you?" But the words wouldn't stop. Max hiccuped, pressing the back of his hand to his mouth, shoulders shaking beneath the heavy fabric. Months of exhaustion and loneliness poured out in great, shuddering waves, and all he could do was cling to the warmth and hope it didn't vanish. Nathaniel Hale, the billionaire whose face was on magazines at the grocery store checkout, whose name was spoken with equal parts awe and disdain on the news, stood there, completely out of his depth, eyes darting around like he half expected someone to jump out with a camera. "Hey," Nathaniel tried again, this time softer. It's okay. Just take a breath, alright?" But Max couldn't stop, not when the coat was so warm and everything else was so cold and Lily wasn't coming back no matter how much he wished for it. His hands fisted the fabric, fingers curling tight. Nathaniel hesitated, then awkwardly laid a hand on Max's shoulder, patting it twice like he was handling something fragile. The gesture was clumsy and unfamiliar, but it was enough to ground Max, if only a little. His breath slowed, tears easing into sniffles. "There," Nathaniel muttered, sounding almost relieved. "See? Not so bad." Max managed a shaky nod, not trusting himself to speak. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, but the warmth of the coat was too comforting to give up. Nathaniel watched him for a moment longer, eyes lingering on the threadbare sweater beneath the coat, the worn-out boots, the crumpled bills clutched in Max's hand. His mouth pressed into a thin line. "You live around here?" he asked, voice carefully casual. "It's too cold to be out without a coat." Max hesitated, then nodded, glancing down the darkening street. Nathaniel followed his gaze, sighing again, though this time it sounded more resigned than annoyed. "Right," he said. "Well, come on. I'll give you a ride." Max opened his mouth to protest, but another gust of wind tore through the street, making the decision for him. Reluctantly, he shuffled forward, the weight of the coat both comforting and unfamiliar. Nathaniel held the door open, brow furrowing at Max's hesitation. "I promise not to kidnap you," he said dryly. Max almost smiled, small and fleeting but there. He climbed in, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing out the cold. The car was warm, too warm, almost, and Max shifted uncomfortably in the leather seat, the coat still wrapped around him. His hands fidgeted, fingers tracing the smooth seams, hesitant to let go even as the heater buzzed softly. Nathaniel cleared his throat from the driver's side, one hand drumming against the steering wheel with a restless energy. It was quiet except for the occasional blip of turn signals and the low hum of the engine. Max stared out the window, watching snowflakes flutter past, white against the dark. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy. "You, want the radio on?" Nathaniel asked, eyes flicking over for a second. Max shrugged, a tiny movement barely visible beneath the coat. "I don't mind," he mumbled. "Right," Nathaniel muttered, turning a dial. Static fizzled, then settled on a station playing something soft and forgettable. It filled the silence without really breaking it. The streets were a blur of frost and faded lights. Max pulled the coat tighter, knees drawn up a bit, trying to warm toes that still felt like ice. He hadn't realized how cold he'd been until the heater started to unthaw his fingertips, making them sting. His eyes drooped, but he forced them open, teeth biting the inside of his cheek to stay awake. "So," Nathaniel tried again, voice a bit too bright. "That coat, where'd you get it?" Max hesitated, fingers curling tighter in the fabric. "It was my dad's," he said, voice soft. I sold it." Nathaniel's brow creased. "Why?" The question was gentle, but it still made Max flinch. He stared at the dashboard, the little glowing numbers counting down miles. "For my sister's. For her funeral." he said, words catching a bit. Mom's trying to get the money, but it's not enough. Nathaniel's fingers stilled against the steering wheel, grip tightening just a fraction. He was quiet for a beat too long, and Max shifted, bracing for a lecture about bad decisions or a strained apology that didn't mean anything. But Nathaniel just blew out a breath, slow and shaky, and turned his gaze back to the road. I see, he said, voice clipped and careful. I'm sorry. Max just nodded, gaze dropping to the hem of the coat, where the stitching was so fine it almost disappeared. He smoothed a hand over it, feeling the difference between it and his own fraying sleeves. The heater's warm air was starting to make him drowsy despite himself. They stopped at a red light, brake lights flaring in a line ahead. Nathaniel cleared his throat again, almost a nervous habit. Your mom, she work nearby? He asked, voice still a bit too forced. At the diner on Maple, Max mumbled. Night shifts mostly. Tips aren't great. Nathaniel nodded, more to himself than anything. The light turned green, and the car slid forward, tires whispering over the snow. You like school? Nathaniel asked after a pause, clearly struggling. Max blinked, surprised into a laugh, a small, shaky sound. Not really, he admitted, honest without thinking. But I guess it's okay when they have hot lunches. Nathaniel huffed a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't come out so stiff. He drummed his fingers once, twice, then forced them to stop. Fair enough, he said. I didn't either. Max turned to look at him, curiosity edging past the shyness. But you're, like, really rich, he blurted, then winced. I mean, sorry. Nathaniel snorted. Don't apologize, he said, mouth twitching. And yeah, I am. Still didn't make algebra suck any less. Max's lips twitched, almost a smile. The tension in his shoulders eased a little, though he still didn't let go of the coat. Nathaniel seemed to notice, glancing over with something close to concern before focusing on the road again. They turned onto a side street where the snow was thicker, crunching under tires. The buildings grew smaller, windows dark and boarded up in places. Nathaniel frowned, gaze sweeping the cracked sidewalks and the lone streetlight flickering at the corner. Max's apartment building was squat and ugly, red bricks faded to a muddy brown and stairs crusted with ice. Nathaniel pulled up beside the curb, engines still rumbling softly. Max hesitated, hands clenching the coat once before forcing himself to unwind. Thanks for the ride, he mumbled, not quite looking at Nathaniel. And the coat. I'll give it back. Nathaniel's mouth twitched again. Keep it, he said, tone leaving no room for argument. Can't have you freezing before you make it to your door. Max stared for a moment, wide-eyed and uncertain, before ducking his head with a nod. He pushed the door open, snow swirling in, and stepped out onto the slippery sidewalk. But he stopped halfway to the entrance, glancing back over his shoulder. Nathaniel was still watching, one hand on the wheel, expression tight and unreadable. Max chewed his lip, then waved, small and hesitant. Nathaniel's hand lifted, a bit awkward, like he wasn't sure what to do with it. The window rolled down a crack, letting in a gust of frigid air. Your mom home? Nathaniel asked, voice low but carrying. Max hesitated. Maybe, he said. She should be. If her shift ended. Nathaniel muttered something under his breath that Max couldn't quite catch. After a pause, he swung open his door, unfolding himself from the car in a smooth motion. Max blinked, surprised, as the man approached, snow gathering in his hair and on his shoulders. The lobby door squealed when Max pushed it open, hinges rusty and complaining. Inside, the heat was patchy, radiators clicking sporadically. The hall was dim, wallpaper peeling in places. Nathaniel's nose wrinkled faintly, but he didn't comment, just followed silently, gaze darting around with a mix of caution and something else. Their apartment door was ajar, faint lights spilling into the hall. Max hesitated, then nudged it open. Madison was in the kitchen, shoulders slumped over the counter, a stack of bills in front of her and dark shadows under her eyes. She looked up sharply at the sound, eyes widening at the sight of Nathaniel in his expensive suit and snow-dusted shoes. Sorry, Max stammered. He gave me a ride. Madison's gaze flickered to the coat, then to Nathaniel, brow pinching with a mix of confusion and alarm. Thank you, she managed, voice strained but polite. You really didn't have to. Nathaniel cut her off with a wave, pulling a business card from his pocket. If you need anything, he said, the words coming out stilted and unnatural. Just call. Madison's lips thinned, eyes darting to Max, then to the card. I appreciate it, she said, voice tight. But we're fine. Nathaniel's jaw ticked, but he just nodded, tucking the card back. Right, he muttered, stepping back. Well, take care. He hesitated in the doorway, eyes flickering back to Max, small and still shivering despite the coat, before he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Nathaniel's office was a fortress of glass and steel, windows stretching floor to ceiling with a view of the city smothered in winter. But the light seemed dimmer than usual, or maybe that was just his mood souring everything it touched. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming the desk, trying to focus on the stack of reports in front of him. The words blurred together, paragraphs of profit margins and forecasts that usually held his attention without effort. He pinched the bridge of his nose, but the image of Max, shivering in that threadbare sweater, fingers white with cold, stayed stubbornly fixed in his mind. Nathaniel scowled, pushing the papers aside. This is ridiculous, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Claire, his assistant, arched a brow from the doorway, holding a tablet against her chest. If you're talking about the forecast, I agree, she said dryly. We've got 3 contracts stalled and the board breathing down your neck. Not that, Nathaniel muttered, voice clipped. Never mind. It's nothing, Claire hummed, unconvinced, but didn't press. She'd worked for Nathaniel long enough to know when not to push. But when she handed over a folder, her gaze lingered a second too long, sharp and knowing. You've been off since yesterday, she said, tone light but pointed. It wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that you're staring at your phone like it might explode, would it? Nathaniel shot her a glare that might have worked if she wasn't immune by now. He dropped the phone onto the desk with a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. It's just, he hesitated, lips pressing thin. There's a woman. And her kid. There. Struggling. Claire's brows shot up. So you do have a heart, she said, grinning when Nathaniel's scowl darkened. Knew it. I should really start a betting pool with the board. Claire, Nathaniel snapped, but there was no real bite to it. She shrugged, unruffled. Look, all I'm saying is, if it's bothering you that much, do something, she said simply. It's not like you can't afford it. It's not that simple, he muttered. I can't just throw money at them. She'll never accept it. Claire tapped a finger against her tablet, gaze turning thoughtful. Then don't make it about charity, she suggested. Make it about opportunity. People hate pity, but they'll take a hand up if it comes with some dignity. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, gears starting to turn despite himself. Go on, he said slowly. Well, Claire drawled, leaning against the doorframe. You've been talking about expanding the community outreach program. Hiring local consultants, people who know what it's like on the ground. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, then snorted. You're devious, he said, almost grudgingly. She smirked. It's why you pay me. By the time Nathaniel found himself back on that rundown street, hands shoved in his coat pockets, the plan was half-formed but persistent. Snow crunched underfoot as he approached the door, hesitating a breath before knocking. It was Max who answered, peering up with surprise that quickly melted into something wary but curious. He hesitated, glancing back into the apartment, then stepped aside to let Nathaniel in. Madison was in the kitchen, a tired shadow of the woman she probably used to be. The dark circles under her eyes were worse, and her hands trembled faintly as she wiped them on a dish towel. She stilled at the sight of Nathaniel in the doorway, eyes narrowing. I told you we're fine, she said, voice cool. You didn't need to come. I know, Nathaniel said, and the words came out rougher than he meant. He cleared his throat, tried again. But I wanted to. Just hear me out. Madison's gaze flicked to Max, who hovered by the door, chewing his lip. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, resignation bleeding into the lines of her posture. She sank into a chair, sighing. Fine, she muttered. Go on then. Nathaniel pulled out the business card again, sliding it across the table. Look, he started, awkward. I know you don't want charity. I get that. But my company's been looking for local consultants. People who understand the community. It's a paying job, part-time, flexible hours. No strings attached. Madison stared at the card like it might bite her. Her fingers twisted the dish towel, knuckles white. Why? She asked flatly. You don't know me. You don't owe us anything. Nathaniel hesitated. He could have lied, said it was about outreach or PR or whatever excuse might sound reasonable. But the sight of Max, small and pale in that doorway, stopped him cold. Because I can help, he said simply. And I want to. Madison's jaw clenched, gaze hardening. I don't need pity, she bit out. We'll manage. We always do. Nathaniel resisted the urge to sigh. This was why he usually let Claire handle anything that involved emotions. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to find the right words. It's not pity, he said, firmer this time. It's a job. One you're qualified for. And it's enough to cover the... He hesitated, swallowing the lump in his throat. Enough to cover the funeral, he finished quietly. Madison flinched, eyes squeezing shut for a heartbeat. Her shoulders sagged, tension melting into something raw and exhausted. Max shifted in the doorway, hands twisting in the sleeves of Nathaniel's coat, and the words slipped out, small and cracked. Please, Mom, he whispered. Just please. Madison's breath hitched. Her fingers stilled on the dish towel, shoulders trembling just a little. The fight drained out of her, leaving only weary resignation in its place. She slumped back in the chair, pressing a hand to her forehead. Fine, she breathed. But just until we get back on our feet. No more. Nathaniel's shoulders relaxed, tension bleeding out in a rush. He nodded, trying not to look too relieved. Of course, he said, voice even. Just until then. Madison's gaze lingered on the business card, fingers brushing the edge like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, voice brittle when she finally spoke. Thank you, she muttered, almost too quiet to hear. Nathaniel's throat tightened. He cleared it, stepping back towards the door with a curt nod. I'll have my assistant call you with the details, he said, voice brisk to hide the tightness in it. She's nicer than I am, so that should help. Max's lips twitched, almost a smile, and Nathaniel found himself returning it without meaning to. The snow was still falling outside, soft and quiet, blanketing the street in white. Nathaniel hesitated on the doorstep, glancing back once more. Madison was still at the table, shoulders slumped, fingers tracing the edges of the card. Max hovered close, one small hand resting on her arm, gaze flicking to Nathaniel with something that almost looked like hope. And for the first time in a long while, Nathaniel felt something in his chest ease, just a little. Madison's first paycheck came in a crisp envelope, the company's logo stamped neatly in the corner. She stared at it for a long time, fingers brushing the seal but not quite tearing it open. The numbers inside wouldn't change anything, not really. Lily was still gone, and the apartment was still too quiet at night, but at least the rent wouldn't be a fight this month. She slid the envelope into her purse, exhaling slowly. The office buzzed around her, too bright and too loud, every phone call and keyboard click setting her teeth on edge. The women in pencil skirts and heels moved with purpose, nails painted and voices crisp, making Madison acutely aware of her scuffed boots and second-hand blazer. She smoothed the hand down her sleeve, trying not to tug at the frayed hem. The spreadsheets on her screen blurred until she blinked hard, forcing herself to focus. It was just a job, she reminded herself. Temporary. Enough to keep the lights on and give Lily a proper goodbye. Her fingers tightened around the mouse, steady but cold. Across town, Nathaniel flipped through reports with the kind of efficiency that left interns scurrying out of his path. His office was a fortress of glass and polished oak, the city sprawling below like a model. Claire leaned against the doorframe, tapping her tablet with a smirk. "So, you've got a visitor," she said lightly, barely hiding her amusement. Nathaniel grunted, not looking up. "If it's HR, tell them I'm busy." "Not quite," Claire said, and the grin in her voice made him pause. "He's a little shorter and less terrifying." Nathaniel frowned, glancing up just as Max peeked around the door, eyes wide and round as marbles. The boy clutched a paper bag to his chest, fingers white at the edges. His sneakers were damp, snow melting into puddles on the marble floor. "What? How did you even get past security?" Nathaniel demanded, though his tone was more startled than stern. Max blinked, shuffling his feet. "The lady at the desk said I could come up," he mumbled, glancing sideways at Claire, who waved cheerfully. Nathaniel shot her a glare, but Claire just shrugged, eyes glinting with mischief. "He's not carrying explosives," she deadpanned. "Or if he is, they're really well disguised." Max's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Nathaniel huffed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "All right, fine," he muttered. "Come in. Try not to knock anything over." Max stepped forward cautiously, eyes darting to the floor-to-ceiling windows and the skyline glittering beyond. His mouth fell open a little, awestruck. Nathaniel hid a smile behind his hand, watching the boy crane his neck to peer at the skyscrapers stabbing up through clouds. "It's hi," Max said finally, voice small but impressed. Nathaniel snorted. "That's kind of the point," he said dryly. Max bit his lip, glancing down at the bag in his hands. I just came to say thank you," he mumbled. "For helping Mom. And for the coat." His ears were red, and not from the cold. He thrust the bag forward, awkward and jerky. "I brought these." Nathaniel blinked, taking the bag more out of reflex than anything. The paper crinkled under his fingers, warm and faintly greasy. He cracked it open, eyes widening at the sight of uneven but carefully wrapped cookies, chocolate chips half melted and edges a little burnt. "Did you make these?" he asked, incredulous. Max ducked his head. "Mom helped," he admitted. "But I stirred the batter." Nathaniel stared at the cookies, at the boy twisting his sleeves nervously, and something unfamiliar twisted in his chest, sharp but not unpleasant. He cleared his throat, trying to gather words that didn't sound stiff or ridiculous. "Well," he said finally, "they look edible." Max's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Hey," he protested, indignant. "They're good." Nathaniel chuckled, surprised at the sound. He plucked a cookie from the bag and took a bite, expecting the worst. The edges were a little burnt, and there was too much salt, but they were warm and soft in the middle, chocolate melting on his tongue. He made a show of chewing, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Max scowled, crossing his arms. "They're fine," he mumbled, cheeks pink. "They're not bad," Nathaniel admitted, lips twitching. "Probably won't kill me." Max huffed, but there was a smile threatening to break through. Nathaniel handed him a cookie with a mock-serious look. "You first," he said. "In case they're poisoned." Max snorted, rolling his eyes. "You're weird," he muttered, but took the cookie anyway, a grin slipping past his defenses. They sat in silence for a moment, chewing, the city sprawling below and snow tapping lightly at the windows. Nathaniel leaned back, fingers drumming absently, and cast a sideways glance at the boy. "So," he said casually, "you like vending machine coffee?" Max pulled a face. "It's gross," he said bluntly. Nathaniel chuckled. "Yeah," he agreed. "But it's free." Max grinned, small but real, and Nathaniel found himself grinning back without meaning to. The quiet stretched, but this time it wasn't awkward or heavy, just comfortable. The door swung open, shattering the peace, and one of the board members poked his head in without knocking, eyes narrowing at the sight of Max perched in one of the leather chairs, crumbs dusting his sleeves. "Nathaniel," the man started, tone brisk. "Is this?" "It's fine," Nathaniel interrupted, voice cold. "I'm busy." The man's mouth snapped shut, eyes flickering with something sharp and displeased. He hesitated, gaze dropping to Max, then plastered on a thin smile. "Of course," he said, tone clipped. "We'll continue this later." The door clicked shut, but the mood stayed sour. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, fingers tapping harder against the desk. Max glanced up, eyes dark with worry. "Did I?" "No," Nathaniel cut in, gentler. "Not your fault." Max still looked unsure, shrinking back a little in the chair. Nathaniel hesitated, then sighed, ruffling a hand through his hair. "Just office stuff," he muttered. "Nothing you need to worry about." The boy's gaze lingered on the door, then slid back to Nathaniel. His fingers twisted in his sleeves, nervous. "I can go," Max offered quietly. "If you're busy." Nathaniel frowned, the words prickling something raw under his ribs. "You don't have to," he said, softer than before. "I've got time." Max hesitated, but the relief in his eyes was hard to miss. He leaned back, nibbling at the edge of a cookie, shoulders slowly easing from their hunch. And for a while, they just talked, about school and vending machine disasters and the time Nathaniel got stuck in an elevator with a jazz quartet. The laughter was small but real, brightening the room in a way that even the city lights couldn't. Nathaniel watched Max grin, crumbs on his chin and eyes bright, and felt something thaw a little, slow and unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the hum of the heater and the faint rustle of paper. Nathaniel stared out the window, city lights stretching into the dark, but his thoughts were far from the spreadsheets and contracts cluttering his desk. Max's laugh still echoed faintly, bright and unguarded, and Nathaniel found himself almost smiling at the memory. It was strange, how quickly the kid had gotten under his skin, weaving through the cracks he'd sworn were sealed tight. He ran a hand over his face, sighing. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the reflection in the glass showed a man tired beyond reason, shadows stark under his eyes. For a moment, all he could see was another apartment, another winter, cold seeping through walls too thin and blankets worn to threads. The flashback hit fast and sharp, his mother's hands, rough and warm, tucking blankets tighter as if they could hold back hunger. The cracked plaster above his bed, the hiss of the radiator that only worked half the time. A Christmas tree barely 3 feet tall, ornaments made of foil and paper, and his mother's smile stretched thin but trying so hard to be enough. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He tore his gaze from the window, pushing the memories back down where they belong. This wasn't about him. It was about Max and Madison and doing something useful for once. The door swung open without a knock. Claire, tablet in hand, eyes sharper than usual. Nathaniel arched a brow, but the look she shot him was grave, all humor gone. "You need to see this," she said, voice tight. She tossed a magazine onto his desk, headlines screaming in bold print. A picture of Madison, blurry and off guard, bundled in her coat with Max at her side, eyes wide and startled. The title dripped venom. "Damsel in Distress or Gold Digger? Billionaire CEO's charity under fire." Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. He snatched the magazine, eyes skimming the text, twisted versions of facts, quotes taken out of context, accusations that Madison had manipulated him for money. Rage coiled, hot and bitter, under his ribs. "Who?" he bit out, voice low and dangerous. Claire didn't flinch. "The Sentinel," she said. "They're already spreading it online. Comments are not great." Nathaniel's grip tightened, paper crumpling under his fingers. "Get their editor on the phone," he snapped. "Now." Claire was already moving, fingers flying over the tablet. Nathaniel shoved the magazine aside, fury simmering too hot to contain. It was one thing to drag his name through mud, he was used to that. but dragging Madison and Max into it, twisting what little help he tried to give, that was a different level of low. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "This is Gregory Lang, Sentinel editor." A voice drawled, smug and oily. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know damn well why I'm calling," Nathaniel growled. "Retract the article. Now." Lang chuckled, the sound grating. "Touchy, aren't we? It's just business, Hale. Can't help if people like a good Cinderella story, especially the kind with a twist." Nathaniel's teeth ground together. "This is defamation," he snapped. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers." "Oh, please," Lang scoffed. "It's not defamation if it's true. Or at least, plausible." The line crackled, tension tight enough to snap. Nathaniel's hand shook with the force of keeping his voice steady. "Print a retraction," he bit out. "Or I'll make sure your next job involves flipping burgers." Lang snorted. "Sure you will," he sneered. "Good luck with that." The call ended with a click, leaving silence ringing in its wake. Nathaniel's hands trembled, fury coiling hot and sick in his gut. Claire's eyes were dark with concern, fingers twisting the strap of her bag. "What now?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel's jaw ticked. "I'm going over there," he snapped, already striding for the door. "They want a story? Fine. I'll give them one." The lobby was a blur of marble and glass, the car ride even more so, city lights streaking past in a haze. By the time Nathaniel stormed into the Sentinel's office, cheeks flushed and tie askew, the receptionist's eyes went wide, fingers fumbling for the phone. "Tell Lang to get his sorry self out here," Nathaniel growled, voice low and dangerous. "Now." Lang appeared with a smirk and a coffee cup, eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. "Nathaniel," he greeted, tone syrupy. "Didn't expect you to drop by. Must be serious." Nathaniel's fists clenched, nails biting into palms. "That article," he snarled, words clipped and cold. "Retract it. Apologize. Or I swear, or what?" Lang sneered. "You'll sue? Go ahead. Won't look great, though. Billionaire CEO bullying a little paper for daring to suggest he's not a saint." The door swung open, interrupting the tirade. Max stood there, eyes wide and cheeks flushed from the cold, fists balled in his two big sleeves. Madison followed, pale and drawn, lips pressed in. Lang's smirk widened. "Ah, the star of the show," he drawled. "How's it feel, kid? Bet it's all very exciting." Max's jaw tightened, shoulders squaring. He glared at Lang with a ferocity that made Nathaniel blink. "You're lying," Max said, voice shaking but steady. "My mom didn't ask for any of this. Mr. Hale just wanted to help." Lang chuckled. "Sure, kid," he snorted. "That's what they all say, it's true." Max snapped, voice rising. "She didn't want anything. She almost said no. You don't know anything, you just make stuff up to sell papers." Lang's eyes narrowed, mouth twisting. "Listen, you little..." Nathaniel stepped forward before he could finish, jaw tight. "Careful," he warned, voice soft but lethal. "That's enough." Max's hands trembled, but he didn't back down, chin lifting stubbornly. "You're just mean," he bit out, cheeks flushed. "Writing lies about people you don't even know. Bet your mom's real proud." Lang's mouth fell open, words stalling. The silence that followed was deafening, the receptionist's eyes wide and stunned. Even Nathaniel blinked, surprised into silence. The smirk melted off Lang's face, cheeks darkening with fury and something else, shame, maybe, buried deep. His jaw worked soundlessly, eyes darting to Nathaniel, then to Max, throat bobbing. "Right," Nathaniel drawled, voice like ice. "I'll take that retraction now." Lang glared, teeth clenched, but the fight had drained out of his eyes. He turned with a snarl, storming back into the office, the door slamming behind him. Nathaniel exhaled, tension bleeding out, and glanced down at Max, who was still red-faced and trembling slightly, fingers twisted in his sleeves. He reached out, hesitated, then rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, grip firm but careful. Max looked up, eyes wide and uncertain. Nathaniel's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good work," he said gruffly, voice warm despite the roughness. Max blinked, surprise flickering, then grinned, small but bright, cheeks still red. Nathaniel chuckled, something in his chest easing for the first time all day. Madison's voice was flat, clipped short like she was sawing off something painful. "This has to stop," she said, hands twisted together tight enough to turn her knuckles white. "We can't, this isn't working." Nathaniel stared at her, words catching in his throat. The hallway was dim, lights flickering faintly above, but her eyes were clear and determined, mouth pressed into a hard line. Max hovered by the kitchen door, small and silent, hands fidgeting at the hem of his sleeve. "I don't understand," Nathaniel said slowly, tone careful. "If this is about the article, Lang's already printing a retraction. It's being handled. It's not just that," Madison said, voice wavering but firm. "It's everything. The money, the job, people stare at me when I walk down the street, Nathaniel. Like I'm some charity case. I can't keep doing this." Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides, jaw tight. "You're not," he started, but Madison's headshake cut him off, sharp and tired. "You don't get it," she said, breath catching. "We've always made do. We don't need handouts. It's not a handout." Nathaniel bit out, voice rising before he could stop it. "It's help. For you. For Max. That's all." Madison's mouth twisted, half sad, half bitter. "Well, we can't take it," she said, shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry." The words landed heavy, final. Nathaniel's throat burned, arguments churning fast and frantic, but Madison was already stepping back, fingers tight on the doorknob. Her gaze flickered to Max, eyes softening, then darted away. Max hesitated, glancing between them, eyes dark and uncertain. His hands twisted in the sleeves of Nathaniel's coat, still a little too big but warm and comforting. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, lips parting. Then Madison's eyes fixed on him, pleading, and Max's shoulders slumped. He bit his lip hard, gaze dropping to the floor. Nathaniel took a step forward, fingers twitching, but Madison's hand landed on the door, pulling it half shut. "Thank you," she said, voice small and strained. "For everything. But it's time we did this ourselves." The door clicked shut, not loud but echoing all the same. Nathaniel stared at the peeling paint for a long moment, breath coming fast and tight. The cold bit through his coat, seeping through seams and buttons, but he barely felt it. He turned on his heel, the snow crunching sharp and brittle underfoot, and strode back to the car. The driver glanced up, eyes widening at the expression on Nathaniel's face, but wisely kept quiet. The engine hummed to life, streetlights smearing into pale streaks as the city blurred past. Nathaniel's hands shook, barely noticeable, fingers tapping a frantic rhythm on his knee. The heater buzzed, too warm, stifling, but he couldn't bring himself to shrug off the coat. "It's for the best," he told himself. "If that's what she wants." But the words didn't settle right, no matter how many times he repeated them. The board meeting the next morning was a headache, voices talking over each other, spreadsheets and forecasts flung across the table. Nathaniel stared at the charts without seeing them, pen twirling between his fingers. His eyes kept drifting to the clock, minutes crawling by sluggish and heavy. When one of the board members cleared his throat, eyes narrowed and judgmental, Nathaniel blinked back into focus. "Hale," the man snapped, lips thin. "I said, this situation with the Sentinel, is it handled?" Nathaniel scowled. "It's being handled," he said curtly. "They're printing a retraction." "And the woman?" the man pressed, tone cold. "Your distraction." Nathaniel's fingers clenched, pen nearly snapping in half. "That's none of your concern," he growled. "Oh, but it is," another member cut in, voice oily smooth. "Investors are nervous. Your little pet project's making them question your priorities. Maybe it's time to let it go." Nathaniel's jaw ticked, but the words dried up in his throat. The eyes around the table were flat and expectant, waiting. Claire's gaze flickered, faintly apologetic but helpless. Nathaniel exhaled slow, tension winding tight under his ribs. "Fine," he bit out. "I'll handle it." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, decisions made, budgets adjusted, and Nathaniel's head pounded with the weight of it. By the time he made it back to his office, door slamming harder than intended, he was strung tight enough to snap. He threw himself into work with a vengeance, hours bleeding into one another, papers stacking high, emails pinging nonstop. It didn't help. No matter how many reports he buried himself in, the silence stretched too long, too empty. He almost picked up the phone twice, number half dialed before he slammed it down, frustration boiling under his skin. It wasn't his problem, he reminded himself. She didn't want his help. But Max's face lingered, eyes wide and lost, fingers clutching at the coat like a lifeline. Nathaniel's hands twitched, restless, but he forced them to stay on the keyboard, scowling at the glare of the screen. The call came late, barely past midnight, phone buzzing sharp and urgent against the desk. Nathaniel snatched it up, frowning at the unknown number, but something cold twisted in his gut. "Is this, Mr. Hale?" A voice stammered, young and nervous. My name's Ms. Lewis. I teach at Riverside Elementary. I have Max here in my office." Nathaniel's breath stuttered. "What happened?" he snapped. The teacher hesitated, voice small. "There was a fight," she said slowly. "Maxwell, he said some boys were saying things about his mom. He's not hurt, but he's refusing to call her. Just keeps saying he wants you." Nathaniel's chair screeched back, coat thrown over his shoulders without thinking. "I'm on my way," he said, voice tight. The drive was a blur, tires hissing over slush, headlights slicing through dark. Nathaniel barely waited for the car to stop, striding into the school, snow melting in wet patches on the tiles. The office door was ajar, light spilling into the hall. Max sat on the bench outside, knees drawn up, hands twisted tight in his sleeves. His cheek was red, knuckles bruised and raw, but he didn't look up when Nathaniel approached, jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. Nathaniel crouched down, heart pounding too loud. "Max," he said, voice rough. "What happened?" Max's breath hitched, eyes fixed on his shoes. They were saying stuff about Mom," he mumbled, voice small. "Calling her names. Said we were just using you for money." Nathaniel's chest tightened, anger flaring hot. He reached out, hand steady on Max's shoulder, grip firm but careful. "That's not true," he said, voice low but steady. "You know that, right?" Max's shoulders trembled, breath shuddering. His fingers twisted tighter in the sleeves, but he leaned in, forehead pressing into Nathaniel's coat, breaths coming fast and ragged. Nathaniel's throat burned, hands gentle as he pulled the boy closer, wrapping him in warmth. For a moment, the world narrowed to the soft sniffles and the faint scent of soap and sugar clinging to Max's hoodie. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel realized he was terrified of losing something more than a deal. The call came late, jolting Nathaniel awake from a restless doze at his desk. The city sprawled dark and quiet beyond the office windows. The screen glowed with an unknown number, and for a heartbeat, he considered ignoring it, too tired and too drained to deal with anything else. But something in his chest twisted tight, an uneasy pull that had him snatching up the phone before it hit voicemail. "Mr. Hale?" A voice crackled, strained and nervous. "This is Riverside Medical. We have Max here, he asked us to call you." Nathaniel was on his feet before the sentence finished, coat yanked off the back of his chair, heart pounding loud and unsteady. "Is he hurt?" he snapped, voice sharp. The nurse hesitated. "Not physically, no," she said carefully. "But his mother, she collapsed at work. Exhaustion, the doctor thinks, but she'll need to stay overnight. Maxwell, he's refusing to leave the waiting room." Nathaniel's jaw clenched, words coming clipped and fast. "I'll be there in 20. He bit out, already striding for the door. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and white, snow spinning in gusts that rattled against the windows. Nathaniel's hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white, jaw locked tight enough to ache. The hospital lights gleamed cold and sterile, reflecting off ice-slick pavement. He found Max huddled on a bench outside, hoodie pulled tight, fingers trembling where they clutched the fabric. The boy's head was bowed, knees drawn up, breath fogging in uneven puffs. The sight stopped Nathaniel short, a fist twisting deep in his gut. He cleared his throat, softer than usual. Max? Max's head snapped up, eyes wide and red-rimmed, breath catching. Relief flickered, fast and raw, breaking through the exhaustion carved into his face. His shoulders slumped, tension draining in a rush, and he scrambled off the bench, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Mr. Hale," he stammered, voice small and cracked. I didn't know who else to call." Nathaniel's chest tightened, fingers twitching at his sides. He reached out without thinking, hand settling firm and steady on Max's shoulder. The boy shivered, fingers clutching the sleeve of Nathaniel's coat, small and desperate. "It's all right," Nathaniel said, voice rough but steady. "You did the right thing." Max's breath hitched, shoulders curling in, and Nathaniel's heart gave a painful lurch. He squeezed the boy's shoulder, turning him gently toward the car, the snow falling thicker now, clinging to Max's hair in damp curls. "Come on," Nathaniel muttered. "Let's get you warm." Max hesitated, glancing back at the hospital doors, eyes dark and uncertain. "But Mom, she'll be okay," Nathaniel assured him, voice firmer than he felt. "I'll stay until she's out. Promise." Max bit his lip, gaze flickering, but the exhaustion won out, pulling his shoulders down and his feet forward. He stumbled into the passenger seat, hoodie pulled tighter, eyes half-lidded with weariness. Nathaniel shut the door carefully, tension thrumming under his skin, and slid into the driver's seat. The ride was quiet, the heater humming warm, Max's head drooping against the window. Nathaniel glanced over more than once, breath shallow and uneven, but the boy's eyes stayed shut, face slack with exhaustion. The penthouse was dark and silent, city lights casting faint shadows on the walls. Nathaniel flicked on a lamp, soft and dim, and turned to find Max swaying on his feet, blinking slow and heavy. "Come on," Nathaniel murmured, guiding him to the couch. "Just for a bit. You need to sleep." Max mumbled something, too soft to catch, but sank into the cushions without protest, eyelids fluttering shut almost immediately. Nathaniel hesitated, hands still braced on the back of the couch, watching the boy's face go slack, lines smoothing out. He exhaled slow, tension bleeding out, and tugged a blanket from the hall closet, draping it over Max with hands that shook just a bit. Max curled into it instinctively, fingers twisting in the fabric, breath evening out. Nathaniel hovered, throat tight, fingers flexing at his sides. The exhaustion was dragging at him now, heavy and insistent, but he couldn't make himself move, not with Max's breath puffing soft and steady under the blanket. With a sigh, he eased down onto the couch, legs stretched out, shoulders slumping back into the cushions. The quiet pressed in, warm and soft, and before he knew it, his eyes were drifting shut, head tilting back, breath slowing to match Max's. Somewhere in the haze of half-sleep, a small hand found the hem of his coat, clutching tight, and Nathaniel's fingers closed around it without thinking, grip firm and steady. Morning came gray and dim, snow blanketing the city in silence. Madison blinked blearily at the nurse's words, cleared for discharge, exhaustion and dehydration, nothing more, and swung her legs off the cot, head spinning. She caught a cab, fingers twisted in the hospital blankets still draped over her shoulders, heart pounding too fast. The driver grumbled about snow and traffic, but she barely heard, eyes fixed on the skyline, mind buzzing with a dozen what-ifs. The elevator ride up was endless, each ding loud and jarring, and by the time the doors slid open, her hands were shaking, knuckles white where they gripped the strap of her purse. She hesitated at the door, half open, warm light spilling into the hall, then nudged it wider, breath catching. Max was curled up on the couch, blanket pulled to his chin, cheeks flushed with sleep. His head rested against Nathaniel's shoulder, soft and unguarded, fingers still clutching the edge of the man's coat. Nathaniel's arm was slung around the boy, head tipped back, mouth slack with sleep, dark hair mussed against the cushions. One hand rested on Max's back, careful even in sleep, thumb brushing absently in slow circles. Madison's breast shuddered, hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes stung, tears pricking hot and sudden, but she couldn't look away, couldn't move, frozen in the doorway with the morning light catching dust motes in a golden haze. Max mumbled in his sleep, curling closer, and Nathaniel's arm tightened instinctively, face softening, lines smoothing out. The sight cracked something raw and aching in Madison's chest, tears slipping free without warning. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shoulders trembling, eyes fixed on the pair tangled in sleep, warmth spilling soft and quiet through the room. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on her chest eased, just a little, replaced by something gentler, softer, hope. The invitation was awkward, stilted and stumbling, words tripping over themselves as if Nathaniel hadn't made a living off speeches to boardrooms and investors. He stood in Madison's kitchen, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, mouth set in a tight line as if bracing for impact. "It's just a gala," he said, tone a bit too brisk. "Company thing. You don't have to." He hesitated, cleared his throat. "I just thought you might. Want to get out. For a night." Madison blinked, spatula pausing mid-pancake flip. The apartment was warm, soft yellow light spilling over the counter, the scent of maple syrup hanging thick in the air. Max, perched at the table, looked between them with wide eyes, fork halfway to his mouth. "A gala?" Madison repeated, brow arching. Nathaniel shifted, one shoulder jerking in a half-shrug. "Strictly professional," he said, words rushed. "Nothing formal. Just food, music. A chance to breathe." Madison's lips twitched, eyes flickering with something amused but gentle. "That sounds pretty formal," she said dryly. Nathaniel snorted, rolling his eyes. "You know what I mean," he muttered. "It's just no pressure. You can say no." Max's head snapped up, eyes bright. "Can we, Mom?" he blurted, nearly bouncing out of his chair. "I've never been to a real party before." Madison hesitated, gaze flicking between Nathaniel, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, and Max's wide-eyed excitement. She sighed, exasperated but fond. "All right," she relented. "But if there's dancing, you're on your own." Max whooped, fork clattering against his plate. Nathaniel's shoulders relaxed, mouth twitching into something that almost looked like a grin. The night of the gala, Madison smoothed her dress for the 10th time, fingers twitching at invisible wrinkles. It was soft green, borrowed from a neighbor and a little loose at the shoulders, but Max's eyes had gone round when she stepped out of the bedroom, so she supposed it would do. Nathaniel's car pulled up right on time, headlights cutting through the snow flurries. He stepped out, tuxedo crisp and tailored, but the way he ran a hand through his hair, half ruffling it, made him look almost boyish. "You look," he started, words catching. "Good. I mean nice." Madison bit back a smile, cheeks warming. "You're not so bad yourself," she said lightly. Max bounced on his toes between them, eyes huge as they pulled up to the venue, glass walls aglow with chandeliers, laughter spilling out warm and rich. He fidgeted with his tie, nose wrinkling. "Do I have to wear this?" he mumbled, fingers tugging at the knot. Nathaniel chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Just for a bit," he said. "You'll survive." Max rolled his eyes but didn't push it, trailing close as they stepped inside. The room was a sea of suits and sequins, glasses clinking and soft jazz curling through the air. Madison's shoulders stiffened, gaze darting, but Nathaniel's hand settled at the small of her back, warm and steady. "You're fine," he murmured. "I've got you." Madison's breath stuttered, but she nodded, letting herself lean into the touch, just a bit. Executives swarmed, smiles sharp and eyes sharper, but Max's bluntness cut through them like a knife, small and honest, questions that left even the smoothest talkers floundering. Nathaniel hid a grin behind his glass, watching the boy dismantle icy facades with simple curiosity. So, Max piped up to one board member, head tipped. How come you're bald if you're so rich? The man choked on his drink, eyes bugging, and Nathaniel nearly snorted champagne up his nose. Madison smothered a laugh behind her hand, eyes dancing, cheeks pink. By the time the speeches started, the tension had melted. Max slumped against Nathaniel's side, face bright and hands sticky from stolen desserts. Madison's arm brushed Nathaniel's, soft and warm, and he didn't move away. When Nathaniel took the stage, the microphone felt cold, metal biting at his fingers. He cleared his throat, eyes scanning the crowd, lingering on Madison's wide eyes, Max's eager grin, hands twisted in the edge of her shawl. The holiday season, Nathaniel started, voice rough but steady, is about family. About coming home. His eyes flicked to Madison, breath catching. And about making sure no one faces it alone. The room hushed, murmurs dying down. Nathaniel exhaled, fingers flexing on the podium. Starting next year, he continued, tone firm, the Hale Foundation will launch a new initiative for struggling single parents. To help them get back on their feet, with dignity. Madison's breath stuttered, eyes going wide, fingers clenching the shawl. Max blinked up at her, mouth open, eyes bright with confusion and something warm. Nathaniel's throat tightened, but he forced the words out, voice softer. This is for Lily, he said, gaze fixed on Madison's stunned face. To make sure no one else has to go through that alone. The applause started slow, building to a roar, but Nathaniel barely heard it, eyes fixed on Madison, her hands pressed to her mouth, shoulders trembling. Max's eyes glistened, mouth wobbly, fingers clutching her sleeve. Back at the apartment, the silence stretched, warm and soft, snow swirling beyond the window. Madison twisted her hands, eyes red-rimmed but dry, breath coming fast and uneven. That was... she started, voice cracked. Nathaniel, you didn't have to. I wanted to. He cut in, tone rough. It wasn't about charity. It was... his throat bobbed. Because no one helped us. When I was a kid. Madison's breast shuddered, eyes wide and glassy. Max took a step forward, hesitation melting, and flung his arms around Nathaniel's middle, face buried in his coat, breath hitching. Nathaniel's arms hung stiff for a heartbeat, startled, then wrapped around the boy, grip tight and careful, breath stuttering out. Thank you? Max mumbled, voice muffled but thick. Thank you? Madison's lips trembled, eyes glistening, and she reached out, hand warm and soft on Nathaniel's sleeve. Her smile was wobbly, cheeks wet, but bright, real. Nathaniel's breast shook, hands trembling faintly in Max's hair. The apartment was quiet but not empty, soft lamplight catching dust motes, the heater's hum a steady backdrop. Outside, snow fell soft and endless, blanketing the street in white. Max's breath evened, fingers curling tighter, and Madison's hand slid down, warm and steady, twining with Nathaniel's. The weight pressing down on his chest eased, slow and sweet, breath coming lighter, head tipping back against the couch. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't lonely. The lights glowed warm and soft, laughter low and easy, Madison's hand firm in his, Max's weight tucked against his side. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something bright and fierce unfurl in his chest, something that tasted like hope, that felt like home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.